Hi, I'm Jamie Gregory from Jamie Gregory Handmade and Jamie Gregory Designs on Etsy. In this video, I'll show you how to create a handmade fabric mask that can be donated to hospitals and healthcare workers to combat the shortage of personal protective equipment during the coronavirus outbreak. This particular pattern is meant to be worn as a cover over top of a regular N95 medical mask to extend the lifespan of the medical mask. Let's take a look at the type of materials that you'll need for this project. First, you'll need at least one fat quarter each of two different contrasting fabrics. The fabric that you pick should be at least a 70-30 cotton blend. The reason why we use two different contrasting fabrics is because it helps the person wearing the mask keep track of which side of the mask was facing out. You'll also need some sewing thread. Then you'll need to download and print a copy of the pattern, which you can find in the link below in the video description. You'll also need some sewing pins, a fabric marker, measuring tape, some fabric scissors, and maybe a rotary cutter if you have one. You'll also need an iron and an ironing board. And finally, of course, you'll need your sewing machine. There are a few steps you'll need to take before you start this project. First, you'll need to pre-wash and iron your fabric, and then you'll need to download and print the pattern from the link provided in the video description below. Once you've printed the pattern, you'll need to cut along this dotted black line, the solid black lines on these three sides, and then don't forget to cut out each of the black notches shown here. Okay, now let's move on to cutting out our binding and tie pieces. Before you start, don't forget to square the edge of your fabric first. This is the yellow fabric you saw earlier, and I'll be using this fabric for the inside of my face mask as well as all of my binding and tie pieces. No matter how long your fabric is, all of your binding pieces should be 1.5 inches wide. If your fabric is at least 40 inches long like mine, you'll cut two pieces that are 1.5 inches wide and 40 inches long, and one piece that is 1.5 inches wide and 20 inches long. If your fabric is less than 40 inches long, you'll cut 5 pieces that are 1.5 inches wide and 20 inches long. If you're like me and you're hoping to create as many masks as you can as quickly as you can to donate to your local hospitals and healthcare workers, then I highly recommend creating your own pattern pieces for the binding. So what I've done is I've taken this black and white polka dot fabric and I've used it to create my own pattern pieces for all of the binding pieces. So I made one shorter pattern piece that's 1.5 inches wide by 20 inches long, and then I also have this longer pattern piece that's 1.5 inches wide by 40 inches long. Using your own pattern pieces for the binding will save you a lot of time. Okay, let's move on to cutting out the face pieces of our mask. You'll be cutting out 2 face pieces, one from each type of fabric. To get started, you'll need to fold your fabric so that you have the selvage ends at the top and bottom. So as you can see, I have one selvage end on this side and I have another selvage end down that way. After you've cut out your pattern, you'll arrange it on the fabric so that this part of the pattern right here that says fold is on the edge of your fabric that's folded. Then you'll simply just cut around each of the 3 sides of the pattern piece. Once you've cut the piece out, don't forget to cut each one of these 6 notches out of the fabric as well. These will be really important later and you'll see why in a little bit. And there you have it. Now we have our first face piece, and this will be the inside of our mask. Next, you'll just repeat that entire process with your contrasting fabric. And here's the second piece, which will be used as the front side of my mask. Alright, let's sew those two face pieces together. So next we need to take our two face pieces and arrange them wrong sides together. And just make sure that you have them lined up perfectly all the way around, including the areas where we have all of those little notches. Okay, so here we see the right side of this fabric and the right side of this fabric. So again, we have the wrong sides of the two fabrics touching each other. Then you can take your sewing pins and just place pins all the way around the outside of these pieces to help hold them together when you're sewing. Okay, so now I have my two face pieces that I've pinned together and I'm ready to start sewing. I've got my sewing machine all ready to go, and you might be wondering why I have these two blue pieces of painter's tape here. For this project, we're going to be using a lot of 1/2 inch seam allowances. So I've put this tape on my sewing machine just as a way to visually mark where the 1/2 inch seam allowance marking is. It just makes it a little bit easier for me to visualize that seam allowance while I'm sewing, so I can make sure I have my fabric in the right spot. I also wanted to mention that I'm using a straight stitch for this entire project. I'm using stitch number 3 on my sewing machine. Now we're simply going to sew these two pieces together on all 4 sides using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, it's time to iron in some pleats. So if you can see, I've placed a little blue sewing pin over here in my ironing board right next to this first little notch on the left side. And all of these notches are actually going to serve as little guidelines or guideposts to help us figure out where we need to iron in our pleats. Make sure that you have the front side of your mask facing down, and then the top part of the mask, which is where the person's nose would actually be when they're wearing it, should be up here at the top pointing away from you. Next, we're going to take the bottom of our mask and bring it up like this until we reach the point of the first set of notches. And what we want to do is basically line up that first set of notches all the way across. And this is where we're going to iron in our first pleat. Now we're going to fold this back down, and as you can see here, now we have our first line ironed in for our first pleat. Okay, so let's move on to the second set of notches. So basically just remember that each set of notches is going to be another reference point where we're going to be ironing in another line for one of our pleats. So we'll just fold the bottom of our mask up again until we have a line connecting the second set of notches. Alright, so I have my fabric folded up, so I'm kind of creating an imaginary line connecting the second set of notches, and I'm going to go ahead and iron that again. So we'll just continue moving down and repeating this process over and over again, lining up each set of notches until we've ironed in all of our pleats. Here I am doing the 6th and final set of notches. And that's how we iron in the pleats. Okay, let's pin and sew the pleats in place. Alright, here we see the front side of my mask, and we need to keep in mind that on the front side of the mask we want the pleats to be aiming down. So they should be going down towards the bottom of the mask. Let's go ahead and get started with our first pleat. Here is the seam that we have created with our iron that's lining up the first set of notches. What I'm going to do is grab that seam and I'm going to fold it down, and on the underside this crease is going to connect the second set of notches. So again, I'm grabbing this seam that we created with our iron that connects the first set of notches, and I'm folding that down to make a crease, and that crease is the line that connects the second set of notches. And so then we can go ahead and just pin that all the way across to hold it in place when we're sewing. So then you're basically just going to repeat that same process all the way down. So now I'm grabbing the seam that connects my third set of notches, and I'm going to fold that down, and the crease underneath will be the line that connects my fourth set of notches. And there you have it. So now we have all of our pleats pinned into place, and now we're ready to go back over to the sewing machine and sew these into place. So we're just going to sew along each side of the mask, once again using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And now our pleats have been sewn into place. Alright, now it's time to mark and sew our darts. So what I've done here is I've taken my original pattern piece and I've actually folded it to mimic the pleats that I now have in my mask. You'll also want to fold along each of these 2 red lines, because that's where we're going to be marking our darts. Next, you'll grab your mask with the front side of the mask facing up and fold it in half like this. Okay, next you'll place the pattern piece on top of the mask and get it lined up so that it's the same size as your mask. So just make sure that you get all of the edges lined up nicely. And then you'll fold the pattern along these 2 red lines, because that's where you're going to be drawing the lines for your darts. So now you can take your fabric marker or writing utensil and just go ahead and draw in those lines for your darts. Okay, so now we've marked the 2 lines for our darts, and in the next step we're going to be simply just sewing over top of these 2 lines. Alright, so I'm back over at the sewing machine, and now I'm simply going to sew over top of these 2 lines that I've made for the darts, and I'm going to sew each of them twice just for good measure. Alright, now what we're going to do is trim off the excess from each of these darts, and we're going to trim it down to about 1/4 inch. And then we'll also trim away the excess all the way around on all 4 sides of the mask, and each time we'll trim it down to 1/4 of an inch. Okay, let's attach our side binding pieces. So at this point in the project, we are basically finished with the face part of the mask, and all we have left to do is to attach the binding and tie pieces. Now, if you're following along with the method that I'm using and you have a total of 3 binding pieces, including one that is 1.5 inches wide by 20 inches long, and 2 pieces that are 1.5 inches wide by 40 inches long, then you can just follow along with these steps exactly how I'm doing them. But if your fabric wasn't as long as mine and you had to create 5 binding pieces like this one that are 1.5 inches wide and 20 inches long, then you should follow step number 10 in the original tutorial, which I've linked in the video description below. Because what you will essentially have to do is take 4 of your shorter pieces like this one and attach them together in pairs so that you end up with 2 pieces that are 40 inches long. Alright, so what I'm going to do next is take my shorter piece, which is 20 inches long, and I'm going to fold it in half, and then I'm simply going to cut that piece in half. So now what I will have is 2 pieces that are 1.5 inches wide and 10 inches long. And these will become my 2 side binding pieces. So what I'm going to do now is take my mask and I'm going to flip it over so that the front side of my mask is facing down and the inside of my mask is facing up towards me. Now I'm going to take my 2 side binding pieces and I'm going to have them wrong side up, so I have the wrong side facing up towards me, and I'm going to place them on each side of my mask, and you want the outer edge of the binding piece to be lined up with the outer edge of the mask. And then you want to make sure that they're centered, so in other words you want to have an equal amount of fabric on this side compared to this side over here. And then you're going to take your sewing pins and simply just pin each of these into place. Alright, here we are back over at the sewing machine, and we're going to sew these side binding pieces in place, and this time we'll be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Alright, so now we have our 2 side binding pieces sewn into place, and what we're going to do now is just press those seams open with our iron. Alright, then what we're going to do is flip our mask over so that the front side of our mask is facing up. We're going to grab this edge of the side binding piece and fold it over about 1/4 of an inch. And then what we'll do is we'll grab that once again and we'll fold it over again so that it covers up the raw edge of the mask. And then we'll go ahead and pin that into place and repeat that process on the other side. Now you're actually going to be cutting off these excess pieces at the end eventually, so don't worry about folding and pinning all the way down. Alright, now it's time to hop back on your sewing machine and just sew a straight stitch along each of those side binding pieces. Once you've finished sewing, you can simply trim the excess from each of your side binding pieces. And now we have our side binding attached. Alright, so now that we have our side binding attached, we're ready to start working on the top and bottom binding. So here I have my two top and bottom binding pieces, and these are my long pieces that are 1.5 inches wide and 40 inches long. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to line each of these up with my mask, and I want to make sure once again that they're centered so I have an equal amount of fabric on each side of the mask. Now, just like before, you want to make sure that the outer edge of your binding piece is lined up with the outer edge of your mask. And you also want your binding piece to be wrong side up, so the wrong side of the fabric should be facing you. And then once you get that lined up, you'll simply just place your sewing pins all along the edge to keep it in place. And then you'll just repeat that same process for both the top binding piece and the bottom binding piece. And once again, just make sure that the outer edge of your binding piece is lined up with the outer edge of your mask, and you have an equal amount of fabric on each side. Alright, now that we've finished initially attaching our top and bottom binding pieces, we're going to come back over to our ironing board and just press those seams open with our iron. Alright, now we're going to check the very ends of our binding pieces just to make sure that the top and bottom pieces are even in length, and if they're not, you can trim them. So let's see, this side looks pretty good, but this side needs to be trimmed just a little bit. Alright, so if you made it this far, congratulations, because you are on the home stretch. This is probably the most time-consuming part of the project though, so I decided to fast forward a little bit, since watching someone iron is probably about as exciting as watching paint dry. But all that I did here is for each of these binding pieces, I folded the outer edge up from the bottom about 1/4 of an inch, and then ironed that all the way across. And then on the other side, I folded down about 1/4 of an inch and ironed that all the way across. And as you can see here, I did that for both the top and the bottom binding pieces. And then also down here at the very end of each piece, you fold that in about 1/4 of an inch and go ahead and iron that too. Alright, so now you're going to grab your sewing pins again, and basically what you're going to do is you're going to take the binding piece and fold it in half, and then you're just going to hold that in place with your sewing pins. So you're just going to go all the way down, folding it in half and pinning it in place. Alright, so now we have both our top and bottom binding pieces pinned into place, and we're just going to sew all the way along those binding pieces using a straight stitch. And there you have it! You've completed a handmade fabric mask that can now be donated to your local healthcare workers.